It's no secret that Taiwan loves Japan. By love, I'm not talking about the shallow weep level. I love Japan because anime is so cool type of love. Taiwanese people love Japan in a deeper way, beyond just the waifus and Hello Kitty. According to recent stats, more than 75% of Taiwanese people pick Japan as their favorite foreign country. 81% said they felt a strong connection with Japan. Knowing this, you're probably wondering the same thing that I was. Why? Dude, wasn't Taiwan colonized by Japan for half a century? Like, what's up with this colonial love complex? To find answers, the first step is to go out and touch grass. I mean, touch Taiwan's grass. Explore the streets, observe the environment. A friend of mine who went to Taiwan on an exchange program once said something that really struck with me. She said, Taiwan is like a duplicate parallel world of Japan, except everything is dubbed in kanji only. Japanese-style architecture, Japan-built railway, 7-Elevens that are very similar to their Japanese counterparts.
Except there's more bubble tea.
And above anything, they're still using this building, which was Japan built, as their presidential office building. Now, the reason why I said still using is because Japan built a similar building in Korea, the Government General of Chosun building. And guess what the Koreans did with it? They took it down, demolished, gone. So Taiwan versus South Korea, we're seeing two completely different attitudes. So why this difference? Now, one common misconception is that it's because Japan was good to Taiwan but bad to Korea. Basically, this argument goes that Japan treated Taiwan very well during colonization, building infrastructures, establishing healthcare, schools, and all that good stuff, whereas they treated Koreans very badly. But consider this, the amount of infrastructure that was built in Korea during Japanese colonization was arguably even more extensive than their Taiwanese counterparts. So this good colony versus bad colony narrative doesn't hold up to fully explain the drastically different attitudes. So in this video, I want to explore the subtleties, the nuances of why Taiwan loves Japan, specifically through the lens of having a comparison group, South Korea. Take an average person from Taiwan, then take an average person from South Korea. Now, here's the deal. This Taiwanese person is far less likely to be anti-Japan because the surrounding environment has almost blocked all possibilities for hatred. First, let's talk about the social environment. When I was little and understood nothing about politics, I could still sense that Taiwan has a really close relationship with Japan because big artists would often collaborate with Japanese talents, and a lot of the Taiwanese dramas I grew up watching were adapted from Japanese manga, such as It Started With a Kiss, Devil Beside You, Romantic Princess, etc. Some movies and shows were straight-up collaboration projects between Taiwan and Japan, a practice that's still quite common today. For instance, this movie released last year featured a love story between a Taiwanese and Japanese character, which was starred by A-list actors from both sides. Now, speaking of this movie, when it was released on Netflix, I was traveling in South Korea at the time, and guess what? I couldn't watch it on Korean Netflix, which is why having a VPN saved the day. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. This VPN works with all major streaming services, so I just needed to change my location to the US or any of the following countries, and immediately I was able to access this movie on Netflix. After binge watching this movie and crying my eyes out because of how emotionally profound the ending was, I felt like I had faith in love again, and I needed more. So I kept playing with this VPN to connect to different locations, and immediately I was able to access a huge selection of similar films and dramas. I also realized that changing the VPN location will greatly increase exposure to shows from the specific location. For example, did you know that by routing to Japan, you will immediately gain access to a whole lot more anime options on Netflix? Now, what I think really sets Private Internet Access VPN apart is that they have a no-log policy that they've successfully defended in court, which means that they don't store any of your personal data, making it the world's most transparent VPN provider, and perfect for someone like me who's always a bit paranoid about my online safety. And you should too, because without a VPN, your internet service provider, network administrators, and potentially the government can see and record your online activities. Luckily, I don't need to worry about it anymore thanks to Private Internet Access VPN, which hides my IP address and encrypts my internet connection. Also, Private Internet Access is available for all platforms, and with just one subscription, you get to connect an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. Plus, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support, meaning signing up for it is basically risk-free. Right now, there's a huge discount if you sign up via my link in the description of this video. You'll get 83% off plus 4 months for free, which works out at only $2.03 a month. Thanks again to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video, and now back to the video. In comparison, South Korea imposed a ban on Japanese cultural imports for decades after the war. Japanese movies, anime, books, and even video games were largely prohibited from public distribution. And this ban was issued under the Anti-Nationalist International Behavior Punishment Act. So by the look of it, it sounded like if you distributed Japanese media, you were low-key in the territory of committing treason. This ban was eventually lifted in the late 90s, but guess what happened in Korea next? So yeah, K-pop and K-drama got really big, and Japanese media never had the same impact in South Korea the way it did in Taiwan. And it wasn't just Japanese media. Japanese fashion magazines, convenience stores, and even aesthetics were all extremely popular in Taiwan. So it's safe to say that Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zs in Taiwan all grew up with constant exposure to some form of Japanese culture, which normalized Japan as this trendy and cool neighbor rather than as a former colonizer. All Taiwanese people think of Goku and Love Letter when they think of Japan. South Koreans are more likely to recall unpleasant historical events. Then let's talk about social norms. In Korea, one of the biggest statutory holidays is Restoration Day, where people celebrate Korea's liberation from Japan in 1945. This day is currently referred to as the National Liberation Day. However, if we go by the original Korean word-by-word translation, it's literally Restoration Day. Normally, the goal of this day is to boost national pride, remember colonial traumas, and essentially celebrate Korea's return to its mother in 1945. Hence the wording Restoration Day. Now, given that this day is a big deal, as long as you don't live under a cave and you somewhat participate in society, even if you have no interest in politics or history, you will naturally absorb the fact that your country was once colonized, and that experience was not very pleasant. However, in comparison, in Taiwan, Restoration Day has been cancelled since year 2000. It was somehow reinstated just earlier this year, but for the past 25 years, this day was no longer a statutory holiday. And the reason for its cancellation is actually quite logical. From Taiwan's perspective, it simply doesn't make sense to celebrate Restoration Day because there's nothing to restore back to. See, in the case of Korea, you've got a very clear us versus them situation. Before Japan's takeover, Korea had long existed as a sovereign kingdom with a strong cultural identity. Japan stood out as the obvious, universally disliked foreign invader. Therefore, when Japan surrendered in 1945, Korea was returning back to the hands of its own people, making restoration a perfectly fitting term. And regardless of which party ruled Korea afterwards, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, democratic or authoritarian, everyone could still rally around Japan being the shared enemy. However, in Taiwan, things are a lot messier. For most of Taiwan's history, societies were organized as tribes rather than as unified state. So depending on who's in power, the narratives of where Taiwan originally belonged may vary significantly. For an average Taiwanese person born after the 1980s, the dominant narrative they grew up with is Taiwanization. Taiwanization, also called Taiwanese localization, argues that Taiwan should define its identity and history through the lens of local Taiwanese people. By this logic, everyone else who came to control the island was essentially a foreign force. So this would mean that the Qing dynasty, which ruled since the 17th century, and the KMT, which took over Taiwan after Japan surrendered, were also just foreign colonizers. In other words, in 1945, Taiwan was simply handed from one colonizer to another colonizer, meaning the KMT was not inherently better or more legitimate than the Japanese. In fact, in some aspects of daily life, one could even argue that the Japanese colonizers did a better job, such as higher hygiene standards, lower rates of petty crime, etc. As a result, grievances associated with Japan's rule become significantly diluted and largely overshadowed by the more recent trauma inflicted by the KMT. Ask a random Taiwanese person and they'll probably recall these episodes much more clearly, making Japanese rule seem distant and irrelevant by comparison. And then there's the political environment. Now, unless you've been living under a rock recently, you'd probably know that there's a huge beef going on right now engulfing Taiwan, Japan, China, and possibly the US. Now, this may prompt many of you to say, yo, this is it. It's all about geopolitical alliance. The reason Taiwan is so fond of Japan is because post-World War II, Taiwan really needed Japan as an ally against the communists. While all that is very true, the thing is, you could argue the exact same thing about South Korea. Like, they're also in the same alliance, and they also need the US and Japan against North Korea. Yet, South Korea and Japan absolutely do not display the same level of affection towards each other the same way Taiwan and Japan do. So, the point is, this extremely cozy relationship between Taiwan and Japan nowadays, where Japan seemingly offers protection to Taiwan, is not just 100% geopolitics. Most of this honeymoon bromance relationship happened in the past 2 decades or so, pushed heavily by Taiwan's pro-Japan politicians. In South Korea, although some presidents are considered more Japan-friendly than others, none of them came close to the tone or intensity of Taiwanese pro-Japan leaders. The most prominent example being this guy, Lee Teng-hui, who was arguably the most influential Taiwanese president and the most respected leader leader ever in Taiwan, often hailed as the father of democracy as he played a pivotal role in transitioning Taiwan to democracy. Now, this guy was very openly pro-Japan. Born in 1923 in Taiwan, which was under Japanese colonization at the time, he grew up speaking better Japanese than Mandarin. Once adopted a Japanese name, later received higher education in a prestigious Japanese university, and quote, always considered himself a Japanese, unquote, before reaching 22 years old. His older brother, Li Dengqin, voluntarily joined the Imperial Japanese Army and died as a Japanese martyr. As of right now, his body is enshrined at the controversial Yasukuni Shrine in Japan. Now, Li Denghui himself also volunteered for the Imperial Japanese Army and directly participated in helping civilians evacuate during the Nagoya incident. So given this type of background, his pro-Japan stance and affinity towards Japan was not just political, it was also quite personal. From openly embracing his Japanese roots to frequently visiting Japan and giving speeches praising Japanese democracy, culture, work ethic, etc., to writing and publishing books in Japanese. This affinity to Japan meant that under his direction, Japanese colonial rule was to be reframed not only neutrally but in some aspects positively, emphasizing Japan's contribution to Taiwan, such as helping Taiwan modernize, establishing institutions, infrastructure, as well as bringing positive Japanese values to Taiwan. According to a past interview, Li said that, quote, Taiwanese people often use the phrase Japanese spirit. It refers to the many positive virtues they learned during the Japanese colonial era: courage, sincerity, diligence, public service, self-sacrifice, a sense of responsibility, and cleanliness, unquote. Now, in that same interview, Li also said that, quote, what I find unfortunate for young people in Japan today is that they receive a one-sided education telling them Japan did terrible things in the past. It was an evil country that invaded Asia. Believing that Japan deserves criticism from the whole world, they have lost confidence. But that's simply not true. In reality, the only countries that criticize Japan are China and South Korea. And even then, their criticism is entirely self-serving and based on their own agendas. Japanese people today must break free from the post-war culture of self-blame as quickly as possible. Now, imagine a South Korean leader saying something like that during an interview. Although some Korean presidents such as Kim Dae-jun are considered pro-Japan, what they did can at most be described as seeking pragmatic cooperation with Japan. Like, they never openly expressed cultural admiration or emotional affinity. So again, this just goes to show how entirely different the political environment is in Taiwan versus South Korea when it comes to dealing with Japan. Now, back to Li Denghui. Given his status as Taiwan's first democratically elected president and one of the most beloved leaders, he held enormous power to shape how Taiwan views or interprets its identity and history. For example, Li was actively involved in overseeing textbook revisions in the 90s that aimed at softening negative portrayals of Japanese colonization, acknowledging that Japanese colonizers left neutral and even positive legacies. These textbooks would also present Japan as not the singular invader but one among several external rulers, again tying to my last point. Another point worth mentioning is that Li was very good friends with Shinzo Abe, and this personal friendship arguably helped to cement the Taiwan-Japan cozy relationship even more. In 2021, a Japanese defense minister said that, quote, Taiwan and Japan are more than friends, we're brothers, families, unquote. In the same year, Abe raised a very famous yet very controversial narrative that really heightened this close relationship, which is the phrase, quote, Taiwan's emergency is Japan's emergency, or if Taiwan is in trouble, Japan is in trouble, depending on the translating source. And this phrase led the framework for Takaichi's recent controversial speech. So overall, because Taiwan had this president who has been very openly pro-Japan, it will set a tone for an environment where being pro-Japan became normal. However, you may wonder, regardless of what the politicians may tell you, memories don't lie. We may not have lived during the colonial era, but our grandparents did, and they could pass down that memory and knowledge to us. So why is it that in Taiwan, even this passage is seemingly blocked? To that, let's talk about the last piece of the puzzle, the historical environment. First of all, the process of how Japan took over Korea was much slower, and therefore it was a much more suffocating experience. Because as the saying goes, a long pain is much worse than a short pain. From the Ganghwa Island incident in 1875 to Korea's formal annexation in 1910, Korea went through 35 years of resistance. So that's like 2 generations of people. This meant that most Koreans had personally experienced some form of confrontation with the Japanese colonizers. This sort of slow and creeping takeover presumably left a much more traumatizing scar. In comparison, Taiwan's takeover was much quicker. This is because Japan played its cards very well and was very strategic in eliminating possibilities of future conflicts. It offered an exit option. Anyone who wanted to leave Taiwan could leave. The people that took that option were mostly Qing loyal elites who should have led anti-Japanese movement. Now with them gone, island-wide resistance was hard to form and quickly faded out. As a result, later uprisings were more or less sporadic and were simply written off as bandit activities and petty violence. In addition, Japan did something else that was very clever in Taiwan. It shared a portion of the economic benefits with local landlords, giving them a clear incentive to support colonial rule. And Japan did this because they just learned a hard lesson from Korea. Over there, Japan had seized land. As you can imagine, that triggered a sea of protest and anti-Japan sentiment in Korea. So in Taiwan, Japan opted to protect the landlords instead, giving them no reason to oppose Japanese rule. And ordinary people who worked for the landlords simply didn't have the influence or status to form any meaningful resistance. Now, this is not to say that generational pass-downs are no longer existent. It's just that such knowledge only exists on a sporadic individual level, and no meaningful political reflection comes out of it. And you go outside and you see all these railways, hospitals, schools built by Japanese colonizers, which probably only leave you with the impression that they did a good job modernizing Taiwan. So yeah, now you should see why hating Japan's past simply doesn't sell in Taiwan. And that concludes the video. World peace, and thanks for watching.